shift gears a little bit and switch to the science side of things. I'll give you the outline for the rest of the weekend in a moment. But I want to begin with the scripture we just read, because this really lays the foundation for how we should approach the scientific issues. And I want to mention what we're going to do, what we're not going to do. So back to Romans 1, wrath of God is revealed. We focused on the wrath aspect briefly. What I want to draw your attention to is the nature of man and what he knows and doesn't know. So Scripture says, wrath of God is revealed against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, not because people couldn't reason themselves into faith, because people know God exists and don't worship the God they know who exists. So that's the first point. They suppress truth and unrighteousness. There are no true atheists, which means there's no need to prove God's existence. People know it. And what they do in response to it, in their sinfulness, is deny it and come up with reasons to suppress what they know to be true. And one of the ways they know God to be in existence, and they even know some of His nature, is from the creation, which makes this creation evolution, again, all the more important. We see His attributes from nature. This is what gives people no excuse. They can't stand before God on the day of judgment and say, well, I didn't know. If only He would have left more evidence. One of the favorite refrains of the atheist community. And that has no basis in reality. Richard Dawkins, these Christopher Hitchens, all these people knew God exists. I say Christopher knew because he's dead now, and now he definitely knows God exists. But those who are still living know it in their heart of hearts, and they're denying it. So then what's our purpose? What are we trying to accomplish when we're talking about apologetics in general, and specifically this debate? We're not looking to prove the Scripture is true. We're not looking to prove God's in existence, because people know that already. What we're looking to do is to remind people of what they already know to be true. Now, usually that won't get you very far, because they'll immediately deny it. No, don't talk. God doesn't exist. And they'll come up with some excuse, and what I see then as our task is simply remove those excuses and say, no, that's not a good excuse. Let's return to the real issue. And point them to the true God and to their crimes against Him. So when we're going to talk about design of the cell or the age of the earth, geology, genetics, we're not trying to prove Scripture, we're not trying to prove God's existence. That's already taken for granted. And in a sense, we don't need to disprove evolution because it's self-defeating. So our research director, Jason Lyle, has written a whole book on this called The Ultimate Proof of Creation. I didn't bring it with, but you can get it on our website. And this is essentially the argument. What we're dealing with is the claim that science proves evolution. And if that claim is true, we have a real problem. Why? What's the evolutionary story? The evolutionary story is we all came from a big bang ultimately that eventually formed galaxies, stars, planets like the Earth. Life spontaneously evolved billions of years ago, eventually evolved into backbone creatures, mammals, humans, without any divine intervention. No design, no intelligence, no purpose. Which means you and I are the product of no intelligence, no design, no purpose, which means our bodies are the product of no intelligence, no design, no purpose. Our minds are, and so are our thoughts. If evolution's true. If evolution's true, if science proves it, then my words that I'm saying are simply random chemical reactions in my brain. The words you're hearing are simply random chemical reactions. You can't even know it's true. We're not even having a conversation, or at least we can't know if we're having a conversation if evolution is true. It totally defeats itself. So philosophically, evolution's a non-starter. We couldn't know, if it was true, we wouldn't be able to know it. It wouldn't be possible to even have a discussion. But that's not how people think. Even if people are aware of this, people tolerate logical inconsistencies, and they appeal to science. And that's what we want to deal with the rest of the sessions. And I've listed some of the claims that we're going to deal with. You might explain that to an unbeliever. They might have no answer. They'll still try to appeal to science. Good science always supports Scripture. That's the main thing I want to show throughout the rest of the weekend. And let me make a side point here and deal with the appeal of the theistic evolutionary and old earth creation claims. Part of the appeal of these other views is that they seem to reach agreement. They help make Genesis and science agree. And that agreement seems to persuade some people. And there's something you should know. Our goal is agreement as well. And when you interpret Scripture correctly and you interpret the science correctly, you will find agreement. Good science is always in agreement with Scripture. But there is a second way to get science and Scripture to agree, and that's to interpret both of them wrongly. If you misinterpret the Scripture and you misinterpret science, you will get agreement. So keep that in mind. Just because someone says, well, I've found a way to harmonize the two, or there's one really good way to do that, and there's one really bad one. So just be aware and don't be intimidated when someone says, well, I've found harmony. So what are we going to try to do? Unbelievers know God exists, yet they come up with excuses, and oftentimes they appeal to science. So we want to deal with some of the major ones that are out there. Some will claim that the design that's obvious in nature, God's attributes are clearly seen, they'll say it's just an illusion. That's what we're going to talk about this evening. And usually following that up right away, they'll say, not only is that, and the reason it's an illusion is because evolution is true. There are multiple clues we see in nature that when you take them together, they point clearly towards the fact of evolution. We want to deal with some specific aspects of that as well, so I'll deal with the evidence for evolution in the first session tomorrow morning. Following that, we'll deal with Adam and Eve. That's come up recently rather strongly because of the existence and prominence of a theistic evolutionary group called Biologos. So Francis Collins is the current head of the National Institutes of Health. He wrote a book, The Language of God. By the way, he was the guy who was the lead scientist for figuring out the human DNA sequence. So he's a smart guy, very prominent guy, and he wrote a book after that, so the Human DNA Sequence 2001, his book 2006, basically saying, look at the human DNA sequence, evolution. He founded an organization, Biologos, because he got so many questions in response to his book. Biologos' main goal is to convince the church to accept evolution. He claims to be an evangelical. He's got a testimony that seems genuine, and he's out there proclaiming, at least his associates are now, evolution's true. And what they've done recently, and rather strongly, is say that genetics denies the existence of a literal Adam and Eve. And this really gets to the heart of Christianity. Evolution being true is bad enough, but they're taking it even farther and saying there is no literal Adam. Now, what does that do to Scripture? Well, Paul says, one man sins, one man saves. And if there wasn't a one man who sinned, well, can one man save? Now, and you go to their website, they'll have theologians, of course, who have credentials and sound persuasive and say, well, maybe we need to reinterpret that. They've got people on the website who are not biblical inerrantists. They think Scripture is errors. Peter Enns is on there. So this is a disturbing issue, and we want to cover what does genetics really say. And then we're going to spend 2 sessions on the age of the earth, since, again, few issues generate more controversy than that. If you want to get people mad at you, you just tell me that you think the earth is 6,000 years old. And you'll probably start a discussion very quickly. And so one session is going to deal with geology. The last session is going to deal with some new findings in genetics just published that we've been working on that I think present a real challenge. And I'm hoping we've applied again to give a session at the General Assembly this year. It's in Houston, so close to us in Dallas, and I'm hoping we can give that talk there as well. So, first of all, what do we do with the claim that design is an illusion? And why do I bring that up? Because the evolutionists bring it up. So there's Richard Dawkins, perhaps the world's leading English-speaking atheist and evolutionist. He's written scores of books. This is a quote from his book, The Blind Watchmaker, dealing with design. So if you're familiar with creation-evolution arguments, you may have heard of William Paley, and he argued a couple hundred years ago, if you found a watch on the beach, you wouldn't think that the action of the waves and the sand over time would have created it. You'd think there was a designer. And so Dawkins is taking that analogy and saying, well, evolution is the blind watchmaker. It replaces God. It replaces the designer. And this is what he says in his book. Biology is the study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose. So even he acknowledges, yeah, they look designed, but that's just an illusion. Evolution is the real explanation. So how do you answer that? What science addresses this? Well, I want to spend the rest of the time, we're not going to spend as much time in this talk as we did last session, because we don't need to answer this, give you an analogy from the cell that I think not only addresses this claim, but gives us insights into the glory of God and His majesty. I titled the talk, Glimpsing the Mind of God, because He created cells on the first few days, or at least day 3, day 5, and 6 of the creation week, and understanding the intelligence that it takes, I think presents a really powerful argument. So, a few definitions before we jump into that. When I talk about design, this is what I mean, so we can all follow it. Something's designed, by definition now, if it's the product of intelligence or made with a plan and a purpose. Now, there's another evolutionary argument we'll deal with tomorrow, and that's a bad design argument. Some evolutionists will say, fine, you say life's designed, why is it designed so poorly? Now, in a sense, that's acknowledging that a designer exists, because bad design is still design. I'll show you why that's not true. It's good design. Their examples are fallacious. But this is all we're talking about tonight. Something's the product of plan or purpose, or the product of intelligence, or both. So that then raises the question, how can we find evidence? The evolutionists say all that quote-unquote evidence simply an illusion. Well, let's start with something we're all familiar with. Instead of a watch, let's look at a house. No one in their right mind will look at this house and say that the action of the sun and the earth and rain produced this structure over a year or even over 1,000,000 years. You can see some obvious plan or purpose behind it. You can see plan or purpose behind this building. That's the building where I did my PhD when I was in Boston, one of the Massachusetts General Hospital research buildings. But really the answer to the question of how do we know it was designed is because we can see people building these buildings. We see intelligent beings at work, putting the steel together, putting the beams together, putting the boards together. That, by definition, then is evidence for design. We see intelligent beings working on it. But of course, that's not the issue. How do we infer design when there are no intelligent beings present? Can you do it? Well, here's a pile of wax. Does that look designed? What about this pile of wax? Okay, yeah, we're all familiar with that, a honeycomb. And so there's a side point here. It's not just humans that possess intelligence. Animals possess a measure of it. Insects possess a measure of it. Is there a design or purpose in this pile of sticks? Is there a design or purpose in this pile of sticks? And if we have any pyromaniacs in the room, some may see a delightful purpose in that pile of sticks. Is there a design or purpose in this pile of sticks? Obviously, yes, a bird's nest. Once again, we can see animals have a measure of intelligence. Look at the flowers in this field. Look at how they're arranged or not arranged. Do you see a plan or purpose behind the arrangement of the plants in that meadow? What about the arrangement of plants in this field? Again, obvious purpose. We know it's a farmer's field. He's arranged them in rows so he can get that at them with his farm equipment. What about the trees on this hillside? Do you see a plan or purpose behind it? What about the arrangement of trees along this path? Okay, there we see it. Now, a side point here. Just because we don't see the plan or purpose doesn't mean there is none. I'm trying to make a positive point here saying when you do see it, there's bona fide evidence of design, of intelligence. So yes, we can recognize design when we see intelligent human beings or intelligent animals or intelligent something doing it, constructing it, but we can also infer design when we see a plan or purpose behind something. Okay, definitions aside, now let's get to some nitty-gritty examples. Here you have the Burj Khalifa. This is in the Middle East, downtown Dubai. Last I checked, currently the tallest building in the world. And I want to walk you through how much intelligence is required to bring this structure to existence. So again, no one in their right mind would claim this just popped into existence one day without any human intervention. But let's ask the question, why was human intervention needed? Why, in the 6,000 years that this planet has been in existence, did the action of the sun on the sand never produce something like this? Why did this only come to existence when human beings were involved? Let's make the argument even easier for the evolutionists. Let's pretend, for sake of argument, the universe is billions of years old. Why in the billions of years of Earth history did this never come about until humans put their mind to the task? So now I want you to imagine you're in the Middle East, sand beneath your feet, hot sun above your head, just sand as far as the eye can see. Why is it that the sun beating down on that sand and on the Earth's crust beneath it never constructed the building? Is it because the sun's not hot enough? Is there not enough energy hitting the sand? And if you've been to the Middle East, you know there's plenty of energy there. The problem is it's not in the right form. So the first problem that you need intelligence to overcome is energy transformation. So let's bring some intelligence to the picture. Let's imagine as far as the eye can see that way, or at least in the distance, you've got an oil refinery. We take that for granted, so now it's making fuel for whatever vehicles we have. And you can imagine a long row of solar panels transforming the sun's energy. So you've got a spigot gasoline coming up close, an electrical outlet. Is that going to bring the structure into existence? Obviously not. Second problem that intelligence overcomes is the problem of useful work. Even if you've got energy in the right form, you've got it connected to tools that'll do the work. So let's imagine now you've got a dump truck, you've got a crane, you've got power tools, and you put them all in a big pile here. You're still not going to get that skyscraper because you also need to overcome the problem of coordinating the work. Let's say you bring in some plumbers, you bring in some carpenters, you bring in some steel workers, and just say, have at it. The plumbers are going to do their thing over here, and if they're not coordinated, you're never going to get that building. So you need a blueprint. So imagine much taller than this building, a big blueprint for the Burj Khalifa. And now the fourth problem that intelligence overcomes, I'm sort of going to lump all together in one, and that's enforcing the plan. Again, we take this for granted because we're intelligent beings and it just happens. Workers come in, they're given instructions that are based on the architect's design and say, do this at this point in this sequence, connect them in this way, and then you get the building. And the foreman or whoever's in charge makes sure that happens. And so once you've overcome all these problems, and there's probably more, but I'm keeping it simple, you'll eventually get that skyscraper. So why go into this level of detail? 4 problems, 4 intelligent solutions, because living things are essentially biological construction projects. You and I began as a single cell. Sperm met egg, life begins. Orangutan begins as a single cell. Penguin begins as a single cell. Reproduction happens, one cell, and then the body is constructed. The same 4 problems that human intelligence overcomes to build the skyscraper, the cell overcomes to build the body. Well, how in the world does it do that? I want to walk through the basic sequence of events in human development, and then we'll break it down into its component problems. So sperm meets egg, that begins the first cell, division starts. 2 cells, then 4 cells, 8 cells, 16, 32. And eventually you get this hollow ball stage, or blastocyst stage. So this is essentially a sphere you're looking inside. That sphere becomes the placenta that implants in mom's womb. This ball of cells becomes the embryo proper. So implants in mom's womb, and that ball begins to, that little clump of cells divides, and begins to sculpt the embryo over time. Head here, trunk here, limbs here, hands, fingers, toes. 9 months later, out comes a baby. Well, the human body is made of chemicals. God made Adam from the dust of ground. And you can break the human body down into its component parts. So this pie chart illustrates the different components. We're about 60, 70% water, so you've got a lot of oxygen, a lot of hydrogen, a lot of carbon. And so hydrogen, oxygen, carbon form the big bulk of the human body, and then you've got some other elements as well. So if you had all these raw materials, oxygen, hydrogen, carbon, in raw form, and you injected them into a mother's womb, you would never get a baby. Well, you might say, well, you need energy. So let's insert some energy. Sugar. You parents of small children know just how much energy is packed into a cube of sugar, which is probably why you didn't give it to your children before this evening. Lots of energy there. You put sugar and raw materials into mom's womb, you're not going to get a baby. Well, you might say that's not how the body is built. We need some biologically relevant raw materials. Fine, let's start with those. So I've just listed them here. You don't need to know the details. These nucleic acids are involved in DNA. Amino acids make the proteins. Fatty acids make the outside of the cell. Let's pretend we have those. You inject those along with energy in mom's womb, still not going to get a baby. Why? Because you've got the same four problems that we found in building the skyscraper. You've got to transform that energy into something useful. You've got to connect it to useful work. You've got to coordinate that work and enforce that plan. Well, the cell does that. How? So sperm meets egg. I'm not going to take an actual view. Here's a stylized diagram of the cell, and don't be intimidated by the level of detail. I just want to draw your attention to two structures. This little compartment here, and this ball right here. First, this, because this little compartment is rather fascinating. So back to mom's womb. Let's say you injected raw materials, you injected energy. You don't need to because mom eats dinner, and food goes to her stomach, gets broken down, bloodstream absorbs it, then delivers it to mom's womb, and the cell takes up those raw materials. It has little microscopic machines, proteins, that break it down even further, convert it to energy equivalents. This is, I think, NADH. These are then sent to the mitochondria. In the mitochondria, you have a very specific structure, more molecular machines that take the energy in NADH, create an electrochemical gradient that another molecular machine, ATP synthase, uses to make ATP, which is cellular electricity. And if you didn't follow all that, that's fine. The point is, these mitochondria are microscopic factories that are working right now digesting your dinner, or whatever you ate, however long ago you ate it. There's a very complex biochemistry that's happening without us even knowing it, that makes a form of energy, a chemical form of energy that the cell can use. This is what it thrives on. Okay, so we have in our cells these tiny microscopic compartments, little factories that solve that problem. Fine, now let's go to this nucleus. Second thing we need is some tools. We're going to have something in the cell that'll take that ATP and do something. So where does that come in? So let's look more at this nucleus. You can diagram it kind of like that with these X's. That's a chromosome. Maybe you've seen a diagram like that. We have 46 chromosomes. 23 come from mom, 23 from dad. And this chromosome is really a tightly coiled form of this DNA, or double helix. That's just free information. You don't need to know that. So this double helix contains the blueprint, basically, but I'm getting ahead of myself. This is copied into another chemical form, RNA. This is translated into another chemical form, protein. And really all you need to know is that those two components do the business, the work of the cell. What takes the energy in ATP and its chemical equivalents? RNA and protein take that, and they do work in ways we still don't fully understand. But here's just a little movie, an animation of what's happening in your cells right now at a breakneck speed. So that RNA, that's what this little black string is being read and translated into a protein. This is what the cell is doing like this in many cells of your body. This is the sort of work that is being done. To go from a single cell to trillions of cells, you've got to synthesize a lot more material. You've got to make a lot of proteins. So this sort of activity, just a tiny, ever so simple and little window into what's happening in your cells right now. Proteins get translated, they moved around the cell, they get docked at a membrane. All sorts of work that's going on as we speak. So here's an image, a stylized image of another molecular machine that's involved in breaking down fats. So you have that in your bodies. This is a protein, it does work. You need to break down fats, get that energy, you need to synthesize things as well. Here's another molecular machine involved in breaking down proteins. I'm a very big fan of machines that break down proteins, like steak. And a big fan of machines like this that break down carbohydrates, like bread, meat, and potatoes. I like these. And once again, you've got to have these because there's an enormous amount of work to do. To go from a single cell to a three-dimensional structure that moves through time, that's an enormous amount of work. And the cell does that with RNA and protein. So those guys solve the problem of useful work. How do you coordinate it all? I already mentioned that. So we talked about these guys being the tools. Let's work the process backwards. So DNA copied to RNA, made to protein. Well, protein comes from RNA ultimately. RNA ultimately then comes from DNA. So DNA really is the blueprint. That's where all the information is stored. The information that says 10 fingers, 10 toes, 2 arms, 2 legs, head up here, somehow, in a way we still haven't figured out, that's written into those letters of DNA. So this is kind of like a ladder. Those rungs of the ladder, that's where each letter of the DNA sequence is. So DNA is the blueprint. It coordinates the work. Now we're at the sticky question of who enforces or what enforces the plan. That's perhaps where we see intelligence most at work when we're talking about construction projects. So who or what looks at the DNA, reads it, okay, now make a hand. Mom and dad don't sit there and tap mom's belly and now make the hand. That's not what happens. So what really goes on? Just a little bit more molecular biology, and that's all you need to know. Let's make another analogy. DNA is really like a book. An instruction manual, if you want. Books are broken down into chapters. That's what these chromosomes are. It's just divisions of sections of your DNA. 46 from mom, like I said, 46 total, 23 from each parent. So these chromosomes, 46 of them, again, very tightly coiled DNA. That's that ladder-like structure, that helix. And each of those rungs is a letter. So letters constitute languages. The DNA language only has 4 letters, A, T, G, and C. It's 4 different chemical constituents. But unlike English books, the total book length is 3 billion letters long. So there's a lot of information. And it's those sequence of letters, and if you look at DNA carefully, you can see what's analogous to words and paragraphs. It's all there in that sequence. Unlike English as well, some of these DNA words can be thousands of letters long. We don't write sentences with words that are thousands of letters long, but that's the language of DNA. So that then raises the question, since DNA is the blueprint, and that's where the information lies, those sequence of letters, who or what reads the letters? Well, we've got these 3 components. We've already talked about the fact that these rungs are letters. This is a sequence. This contains information. It's copied into another chemical form, slightly different RNA. RNA is translated into a different chemical language, proteins, and proteins do some of the business of the cell. So who is looking at this and reading it? Well, proteins can recognize sequences in DNA. It's a chemical recognition. And of course, DNA ultimately contains the information for proteins. RNA can recognize specific letters chemically in DNA, and of course DNA contains the information from RNA. And even at this step, there's an interaction. Proteins interact with RNA. RNA contains the information for proteins. There's this complex loop of interaction. And that's an oversimplification. And let me make a side point here, because this is really incredible. I've said DNA is the blueprint. It contains the information for this and for every other species out there. We've said these guys are the tools, and these are encoded by DNA. So DNA is a blueprint, and it's essentially a toolbox, because it's got the information for the tools. And because there's this interaction loop, this interaction of information, it is an information processor. It helps enforce the plan. So you've got 3 functions in a single molecule. In the human realm, this is separate from the toolbox. The toolbox is separate from the information processor. Yet in the cell, all 3 functions in one. Humans haven't even come up with something like this. Here's a diagram of some of the chemical reactions that go on in the cell. You don't need to see the details. What I just want you to appreciate is how many different chemical transformations take place, because that little corner is part of a much bigger diagram of all that happens inside the cell. There's an enormous amount of information processing going on all the time. That's what's happening in the cell. Now, we've gone through how the cell solves each of these 4 problems. When we talked about the Burj Khalifa, we observed that intelligence was required to solve all these problems. And so that raises the question, if the cell substitutes for intelligence, what is the source behind the intelligence of the cell? And we can give a negative answer to start with. We know that evolution is not the source of information behind the cell. Why? Because Darwin said so. Where did Darwin say so? Well, he gave a test for evolution that many folks are unaware of, or that many evolutionists like to ignore. He said this: if it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down. And that's a real mouthful of Victorian English. So let's think of it in simple terms. He's saying, I'm trying to explain the origin of everything out there. Plants, bacteria, people, animals, you name it. So if you can find something, a complex organ, a complex species, a part of a complex species, that you cannot evolve step by tiny step, then my idea is a failure. So Darwin is distinguishing evolution from miraculous intervention. He's saying evolution doesn't happen where a dinosaur lays an egg and out pops a human. That's a big leap. He says, no, dinosaurs slowly, step by tiny step, evolved into birds. Reptiles slowly, step by tiny step, evolved into mammals. Mammals, step by step, into primates. Primates into humans. It's almost imperceptible. And he says if there's something you can't build by that process, then evolution's a failure. Another way of saying this is, if you've got a system where there are multiple interdependent components, in other words, if you remove one, the system collapses, you can't evolve that step by tiny step because you need all parts there present at the same time or it doesn't work. Well, what did we just discuss? DNA interacts with protein. Protein interacts with DNA. All three of these molecules are interdependent upon one another. It's really a chicken and egg problem. Which came first in the evolutionary history of life, DNA, RNA, or protein? DNA is not going to do anything unless it's got protein to read it. Protein can't do anything unless it's encoded by the DNA. There's this problem here for evolution. The evolutionists have said, well, maybe RNA evolved first because it can do some things on its own. And that's true. But life is based on this three-part system. So even if you can evolve something simpler, eventually it's got to convert to this. And that's not a step evolution can take without a miracle. So the origin of the cell cannot come about by evolution because Darwin said so. That's not the explanation. It's a failure. But that still raises the question, where did the information, where did the intelligence for this cell come from? Let's go back to our Burj Khalifa analogy. Before I do, let me stop for a moment. The evolutionists might say, at this point, before we get further, they might say, well, no intelligent beings are involved in the cell, so forget what Darwin said. The fact that it can do it on its own shows you no God's required, and that's missing the analogy. So let's take our Burj Khalifa analogy further. Let's say I put you in charge of making another Burj Khalifa. You've got to go back to the Middle East and build that thing all over again. And I'm not going to let you have people. You're not allowed to have any construction workers. You've got to program robots to build the refinery, to make the solar panels, to build the tools, build the crane, the blueprint, and make it all happen. Do you think that would require more intelligence on your part or less than what they originally did? Obviously more. That's an enormous amount. But I said, that was just a joke. What I really want you to do is to program a computer chip. And we're going to fly a plane over the hot desert sands and drop it in the middle of the desert. And as soon as it hits the sand, it's got to, on its own, make an oil refinery, a factory, a solar panel, the tools, everything. And on top of that, it's got to correct errors in the process. Mistakes happen, so it's got to have some system to say, that doesn't go there. You've got to try again. And then when all is said and done and that thing gets dropped, Burj Khalifa is built, it's got to spit out another computer chip. Why? Because living things reproduce. They make copies of themselves. Would that require more intelligence or less? We're in the realm of science fiction because the collective human intelligence on the planet hasn't even come up with anything close to this. I mean, it's a joke what we're talking about because no one can do that. So does the fact that the cell performs all of these tasks without any human involvement point towards less intelligence or more? It points towards a superintelligence. The cell does things for which we have no good analogies in the human realm. It exceeds our best analogies. It points towards something beyond anything all the humans on this planet can do together. And God did all this in 6 days during the creation week. When He created these creatures, He made them of cells, and He gave them the ability to reproduce and to correct errors. And this process has been going on for 6,000 years without fail. So does biology look like it was designed, but that design is an illusion? Is that a rational conclusion? If the best intelligence on the planet can't even come close to what the cell does? No. So I think a good analogy reveals the error of this way. That's not a good scientific view. And tomorrow we're going to talk about some of these other claims, and hopefully you'll see the same point. Good science always confirms Scripture. When you interpret the Scripture correctly, interpret science correctly, you will get harmony. If you interpret them both wrong, you'll get harmony as well. So what we'll see tomorrow, spoiler alert, is that evolutionists interpret the science incorrectly, but I want to show you how they do it. A few minutes now on what we have at the table. This talk I've basically turned into a book chapter, and that's in this book, Creation Basics and Beyond. This has been a team effort. You can see all these names down here from the guys on staff. We've got chapters on astronomy, chapters on geology, chapters on dinosaurs, chapters on biology. It's sort of your one-stop, in-depth answers to a whole bunch of questions. So kind of like the Answers in Genesis Answers Books series, but a little bit more in-depth. And I'll be referring to this book more and more throughout the weekend. I've got a couple chapters in here. Some of what I cover tomorrow is in here as well. We've got a new series of books we've started. This is the first one, Guide to Creation Basics. It's kind of this book, but in simpler form and glossy with lots of photos. If you've ever seen the DK books that you can get at Barnes & Noble, kind of these 2-page spreads on a topic, there's a DK book on evolution. This is kind of the ICR answer to the DK evolution book. Creation A to Z, how do we explain natural evil, what about distant starlight, but in simple form, lots of pictures. And book 2 we've just come out with, written by our zoologist, Frank Sherwin, on animals. So this is kind of your book on animals that you'd find at Barnes & Noble, but safe. Nothing evolutionarily referenced and with additional testimony to God's creation and design. I think we didn't have these stocked in the warehouse. This is an Answers in Genesis product that we carry, so you can get it from our website or their website that deals with creation A to Z at an elementary level for kids. 4 volumes of that. I'll be talking about dinosaurs Sunday morning. This is also a kid's book, Dragons, Legends and Lore of Dinosaurs. So I think a lot of these dragon legends are probably references to humans and dinosaurs walking together, which is a very radical view in today's culture. You may as well think the earth is flat. Humans and dinosaurs didn't walk together. Millions of years ago, they died out. So this is a really fun interactive book for kids. Our science writer, Brian Thomas, is sort of our Mr. Dino Man at ICR. He's got a great talk on dinosaurs. They filmed him this past summer doing it. That's his PowerPoint and live of him giving that talk. Our astronomer Jason Lyle gave a seminar on astronomy at that same summer series. So we're not going to cover the question in depth of how do you get light from distant stars here. He's got a great explanation for it. He covers it in this video. Our medical doctor, Randy Galuza, gave a lecture in that summer series as well on how to make a baby. So this isn't embarrassing anatomical detail. This is sort of the anatomical and physiological approach to what I talked about tonight. I sort of gave the cell biology approach. Well, what happens if you don't have a placenta? What is mom and baby doing together to keep the baby alive? It's a real, the process of human development in the womb is a real testimony to God's handiwork and inexplicable by evolution. And his medical background is invaluable in giving that lecture. So that's a DVD we have on the table as well. Again, our Acts and Facts is free. I didn't mention this last hour, but I'll mention it now. I have a public Facebook page, so I'm happy to answer questions after each session. If you don't get your question answered, or if you think of something Monday morning, you just got to know. You can email our website. Sometimes they get to us, sometimes they don't. This is sort of a backup in case it doesn't get to me. Just message me if you're on Facebook. And there's a pretty good chance if you got a question that didn't get answered, other people do as well, so it gives me a chance to post a response publicly or write an article about it. I had a dad come to me just a few weeks ago in my church who has a daughter in college, has to take an evolution course. She's pre-vet and required to take this course, and radiometric dating came up, and she messaged her dad, "Dad, what do we do with this?" And so I wrote him a response, turned it to be 2,000 words. I was like, that's a 3-page ICR article. So here goes a series. And again, our website, lots of free resources. I'll be around afterwards to answer questions. Again, we've got more resources in the back table. We've got a few on geology. I'll talk about those and what's in them tomorrow afternoon. Again, tomorrow morning we're talking about evolution at 9. There's breakfast early. Well, you have the schedule. 9:15. Okay. Thank you again for your attention. I'll be around if you have questions. And fellowship in the back.